Welcome to the next episode of the Edgar Rice Burroughs mini podcast. These short podcasts are meant to supplement the full-length episodes that I host along with Jess Terrell and Scott Stewart, in which we usually discuss one of the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs in detail. Right now, we're using the mini podcast to analyze the 1912 novel Tarzan of the Apes on a chapter-by-chapter basis. My name is Tim DeForest. I'm the author of several books on what I like to call pre-digital pop culture, things like old-time radio, pulp magazines, and newspaper comic strips. And I keep a blog on those subjects at Comics, Old-Time Radio, and Other Cool Stuff. With the mini podcast, we are currently up to Chapter 10, titled The Fear Phantom. Please note that I will be including spoilers, both for this novel and sometimes for later novels in the series. And I would also recommend that you reread this chapter before listening to this podcast, as I will be assuming that you're familiar with the events of the chapter as I talk about them. Now, this chapter picks up right where Chapter 9 left off, with Tarzan observing the native village with fascination and curiosity. Now, I like the way that Burroughs sets up Tarzan's attitude here. He recognizes the natives are men like himself, but he thinks of them as probable enemies. This isn't just because one of them has killed Kala. He had also been taught all his life that anything outside the tribe of Kershak was an enemy, even the tribes of other apes. So, since these men aren't a part of that tribe, they must be enemies. It's a logical extension of what Tarzan had been taught all his life. We also see Tarzan's intelligence at work here again, as he observes a native woman coating the arrows with poison. To quote from the novel, quote, Tarzan of the Apes was fascinated. Here was the secret of the terrible destructiveness of the archer's tiny missiles. He noted the extreme care with which the woman took that none of the matter should touch her hands. And once, when a particle spattered upon one of her fingers, he saw her plunge that member into a vessel of water and quickly rub the tiny stain away with a handful of leaves. Tarzan knew nothing of poison, but his shrewd reasoning told him that it was this deadly stuff that killed and not the little arrow, which was merely the messenger that carried it into the body of its victim. So, when the opportunity presents itself, he swipes a bunch of the arrows. He's already got Kalango's bow, and he decides to steal a spear when he gets a chance. So Tarzan is on the verge of taking another step up from the apes as he learns to use weapons that, in addition to the knife he's now been using for several years, will guarantee his rise to Lord of the Jungle. We also see a malicious sense of humor at work. In future novels, Tarzan will always say he prefers the jungle to the hypocrisy of civilization. But it's undeniable that meeting Jane, D'Arnaud, and others and his experience in civilization have a side effect of strengthening his moral character. In this novel, Tarzan can be a bit of a jerk in the cruel jokes he plays on the natives. And of course, he can be pretty casual about killing one or more of them from time to time. The Tarzan we meet in later novels was a master of psychological warfare, and he could play on superstitions much the same way a younger Tarzan does here, but only as a tactic for battling villains. We see this, for instance, when he leads the Wazari against Arab slave traders in The Return of Tarzan. But he's never cruel simply for the sake of being cruel. As much as he disdains civilization, it's his exposure to civilization, or at least his relationships with good people like D'Arnaud, that eventually allows him to outgrow this maliciousness. Burroughs also mentions that at times, Tarzan in his youth had killed for pleasure rather than just for food, something else we won't see him doing when he's older. So, despite Burroughs using the idea of hereditary instinct to keep Tarzan from eating human flesh, the author clearly understands that a sense of right and wrong is something that must be taught. It's not something we come by naturally. Here, Burroughs makes it clear that Tarzan really doesn't understand superstition. Though he doesn't really understand superstition, the ape man quickly learns to use the superstitious fears of the natives to his advantage. We see him begin to do so in this chapter with the skull-top display he leaves behind in the chief's hut. And though he eventually plays on these fears in a practical way, since we will see the natives leaving offerings of poisoned arrows for him later in the novel, right now, Tarzan is just having cruel fun at their expense. Burroughs' portrayal of the natives continues to be pretty stereotypical. and we never see any of them given individual personalities. Because this novel quite properly centers on Tarzan, there simply isn't time for more in-depth characterizations of individuals. A later novel, The Jungle Tales of Tarzan, is a flashback that takes place during chapter 11 of this novel. Here, Burroughs does present some of the natives as individuals, and though there is a witch doctor who's pretty rotten, he presents some of them in a sympathetic light. Burroughs was obviously a product of his time, and he obviously accepted some of the hurtful racial attitudes that existed in 1912. But in the end, he did show respect for individuals, and he recognized the worth of all human beings. We need to consider Burroughs' entire canon to see this, and we need to not tunnel vision on specific incidents. It is, I think, a mistake to believe that Burroughs approved of Tarzan's actions towards the natives. It's clear from Tarzan's actions in later novels, especially an epiphany Tarzan has in The Return of Tarzan, which I'll discuss in a later podcast, that Burroughs knows there are some things Tarzan has yet to learn about being a good human being. In terms of characterizations, it is this learning curve that makes Tarzan so relatable to us. So that's it for chapter 10. Once again, my name is Tim DeForest. Please visit my blog at Comics, Old Time Radio, and other cool stuff. You'll also find a link to my Amazon.com author page there. Keep an ear out for both future mini podcasts and future episodes of our full-length podcasts. And thank you for listening.